Scripture reading is from the book of Ezra, chapter 1. The proclamation of Cyrus. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you, of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Then rose up the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred up to go up to rebuild the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem. And all who were about them aided them with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, with beasts, and with costly wares, besides all that was freely offered. Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem, and placed in the house of his gods. Cyrus, king of Persia, brought these out in charge of Mithredath the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And this was the number of them: 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver, 29 censers, 30 bowls of gold, 410 bowls of silver, and 1,000 other vessels. All the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up when the exiles were brought up from Babylonia to Jerusalem. This is the word of God.
And welcome to Living Faith Community Church. Thank you, Steve, for that wonderful scripture reading. You had all the names right. It was incredible reading. Great to see you all here once again on this beautiful Sunday. Welcome, youth group students, to your service. I hope you can get into studying this passage together for the next several weeks. We have been going through a book in the New Testament called Ephesians, and it's been my practice for the last several years, I guess, to preach a series of sermons from the New Testament and Old Testament, and then go back to the New Testament, and then go back to the Old Testament, New Testament, Old Testament, like that. So we're coming back to the Old Testament, and I thought it'd be great to share a message from book of Ezra and Nehemiah. This is not just Ezra, but it's Ezra and Nehemiah, and it's in the old days considered by many scholars. They thought that it was just one book, Ezra and Nehemiah, because Nehemiah starts off with where Ezra ends, and it's a natural pickup. So I think I agree with many scholars who say this is just a one book. As I was reading through Ezra and Nehemiah and studying this passage, I thought, what would be a theme of this book in one sentence? And this is what I came up with: restoration of God's people by returning to God and rebuilding the temple. Restoration of God's people by returning to God and rebuilding the temple, and that is the theme of the book. So I had 3 words that I intentionally added in there: return, rebuild, restore. I like, sets of 3 things. It's always 3 points: God of Trinity, and I love number 3, and that's why we have 3 sons, and it's 3 points: return, rebuild, and restore. That's the theme, and I want you to have that theme as you read through the book of Ezra. By the way, just out of curiosity, how many of you have ever heard a sermon series on Ezra? If you can raise your hand. 1, 2, okay. If you've been coming to our church for 10 years or more, or 20 years or so, you probably never heard from me because this is my first time preaching through the book of Ezra. And I've preached through many books in the New Testament, but this is a narrative, so we have to read this book a little bit differently than reading through books like epistles, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians. So we would have to read it a little bit different because it's a different genre. To understand the context, I think we have to go to a different book in the Bible, the book that comes right before this passage, or Ezra, and it's from 2 Chronicles chapter 36. In 2 Chronicles chapter 36, 14 to 16, this is the context. And it will help us understand what's going on in Ezra 1 and 2, and then up to all the chapters, and then Nehemiah, if we understand this from 2 Chronicles. All the officers of the priests and the people likewise were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. And they polluted the house of the Lord that he had made holy in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at the prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. So basically, the people of Israel, the Jews, polluted the house of God, and they did whatever was right in their own eyes, going all the way to the time of Book of Judges, and there was no king, and they did whatever was right in their own eyes, and they had, now God provided them kings, and even throughout the kings of northern Israel and southern Jews, that they were just going through all kinds of stuff, sinful stuff, and abomination to the Lord. And God sent messengers, and they were mocked, and they didn't pay attention. So God said, okay, I'm going to have to teach you a lesson. I'm going to have to train you. So God allowed the Babylonians to take over the nation, and they were sent off to foreign land. The Babylonian exile lasted about 70 years, from approximately about 586 BC, when the Babylonians destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and they took all these Jews into captivity. And there was a Babylonian empire that reigned that region, and the Jews were sent off as like slaves. As history would tell us, there's no earthly empire that lasts forever. So there's another empire that came about, and it was the Persian Empire that conquered the Babylonian Empire under the leadership of Cyrus. And that's the guy we just read about in Ezra chapter 1. And the book of Ezra begins with the Jews returning and rebuilding of the temple of Jerusalem. The Persian king named Cyrus, and his spirit was stirred by God, and he allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. Who made all this thing happen? Of course, God made all this happen, and God moved this pagan king's spirit. So this chapter is not about Nebuchadnezzar or Cyrus. It's not about Sheshbazzar or even Ezra or Nehemiah either. It's not even about the Jews. It's all about the God of history. That God is in control of all things, and he rules and reigns. And that's what we're going to look at today. So we'll share three things. I'll share three things from this passage: the Lord of history, the Lord of promise, the Lord of worship. If you belong to our community group in our church, we're going through this new series of Ezra and Nehemiah. And the first chapter of this Bible study is titled The Lord's Work. So this is where I got that idea from: the Lord of history, the Lord of promise, the Lord of worship. Look at verse 1 with me. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there, or if you have your machine, whatever you have, you can open it up. It says, "Then the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia." The word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The word that came out of the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia. Now, if you read this, I know you're just filled and overcome with curiosity. So what did Jeremiah say before? About close to 70 years ago, Jeremiah said something, and the word of Jeremiah must be fulfilled. So that his word might be fulfilled, God moved the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, to make this happen, whatever it is. So I know that you're so curious about Jeremiah's words, so I'm giving you Jeremiah 25. We have to understand the context. Jeremiah 25, verses 11 to 12. This is what it says: "This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation and the land of Chaldeans and Babylonians, same, for their iniquity, declares the Lord, making the land an everlasting waste." So what do we learn from here? That God had planned all this beforehand. About 70 years before, God spoke through the words of Jeremiah, his prophet. He says, "I am going to send my people to Babylonian exile for 70 years. And after 70 years are done, they're going to return to their land." And he planned it. And then he moved the spirit of Nebuchadnezzar to bring the Jews into the Babylonian exile. And after 70 years, God moved the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, to bring the people back to the land. That God is a sovereign God and he is in control of history. So let's talk about that. God allowed the Babylonian Empire to take the Jews into exile. And from this exile, we learn about God's sovereign plan, and you're going to hear this word a lot from me throughout next several Sundays. God is sovereign. That he's sovereign in his leading his people into exile and bringing them out of the exile and their misery. The Jews had to go through suffering and hardship in foreign land with no permanent stability. And they went through this. They were suffering. They were people of God. There were people who belonged to God and they experienced suffering. And of course, it was part of training that God was doing for them. But if you think there should be suffering for God's people, then you just have naive optimism. That don't be so naive and filled with naive optimism that, hey, there shouldn't be any suffering for God's people. God is in control. God is our good God, and no suffering at all. If you're suffering whatsoever, it must be a result of your sin. No, that's not what we're learning here. It is God's sovereign will that he leads. But at the same time, if you just take suffering as like inevitability of life, then it just makes you a stoic. You're not a Christian yet. So we have to have this good balance and think of the Christian way of understanding suffering. You're not to have just naive optimism, or we can't just be stoic, but what is God teaching us here? You see, during the Babylonian exile, the Jewish people suffered greatly. They were forced to leave their homes, families, and communities, and they were taken to the foreign land. And they were forced to adapt to the new culture, new way of life. Many Jews were separated from their families, and some were sold into slavery. The Babylonian exile had a profound impact on this Jewish culture and religion. And they were cut off from their temple worship. The temple was destroyed. They were no longer in their own land, and they were in foreign land, and they couldn't worship God, and they were so desperately dry in their spirit. Of course, there were some who assimilated into the culture of Babylonian lifestyle. For example, if we're going to understand this time, we would read Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther together. Esther, for example, was completely assimilated into their culture that she even became a queen of that country. So there were some who assimilated, some who were saying, okay, I have to hide my Jewish identity and I'll just assimilate to the culture. But there were some who were still really persistently separated. So there were assimilationists back then, and there were separatists back then as well. There were people who were saying, hey, we have to sync with the culture and the nation. We have to be like them. And there were some people who said, no. We can't assimilate with these pagans. We got to keep our own heritage and our tradition that we're Jewish people. So they were probably divided in their culture, in their makeup of population as well. But many Jews, I think, felt like they were stuck in their situation with no place to go. Can you imagine having no national identity? No national identity. No place of worship. No purpose in life. And even if you do, and even if you want to do something in your life, there's no resource available to you to fulfill that. Where you feel completely stuck. When you look at your life, you feel stuck. Here am I in a foreign land. This is what many Jews felt. And this is probably some of you might feel. Where you feel stuck in your situation and you feel anxious about your future. What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to this world? What's going to happen to my life in 10 years, 20 years? What's going to happen to my children? What's going to happen to my children when I pass? What's going to happen to this church? What's going to happen to our relationships? What's going to happen to me? And many of you are afraid of losing what you have now. And I told this story before, but I never forget this conversation I had with someone I thought was pretty stable financially. She was very, very, I think, in my own judgment, of course, very financially stable. And I asked her, what's your greatest fear? And she said, my greatest fear is being poor. I said, you're afraid of being poor? You have so much financial resource. And she said, that's my greatest fear. And many people here, I'm included, live with fear. Fear of what we might lose. Fear of what we might not attain. And I think that's why John Newton said this beautiful phrase, everything is necessary that God sends, and nothing can be necessary that He withholds. And that's very, very important quote that I want you to look at. that everything is necessary that he sends, and nothing can be necessary that he withholds. He wrote these words to his friend named John Ryland in 1774, and soon after his wife died. Can you imagine? His friend was probably going through some difficulty in his life and hardship, and he wrote this letter and said, "My friend, everything is necessary that he sends. If you have it, whether it's suffering in your life, whether it's pain in your life, whether it's challenges in your life, whether it's a problem with your spouse, with your children, or whatever happens in your life, whatever you have, everything is necessary that he sends. But nothing can be necessary that he withholds." If you think, "God, I wish only if I had this. Only if my child was this way. Only if my husband or wife was this way. Only if my life would turn out this way." Nothing can be necessary that he withholds. I think he reflected on these words a lot, because soon after he wrote these words to his friend, his wife died. And soon after, his child died before him. Everything is necessary that he sends. Whatever you're experiencing now, nothing can be necessary that he withholds. I don't think we can get through life without reflecting on this little saying. That he is a God of history, God of control, God who sovereignly controls all things in your life. If there is one doctrine that really helps me to go through life, I think this is it. That God is sovereign. Sometimes I am embarrassed to say this, but I say this, and I'll try to be as vulnerable as possible just to get the point across to you. Sometimes I scream and shout at God and say, "God, you better be sovereign." I know I'm being rude. I know I'm only a dust in your presence, but you better be sovereign. Because there are things in life that are just too hard to endure. I hope you're sovereign. And you better be. Don't get me disappointed at the end of the day, God. And I come out with a sense of assurance, looking through all the things that happen in history in my life. God is sovereign. He is in control. The Lord is not only the Lord of history, but He is the Lord of promise. As we look at this passage, I want you to think about this verse in the New Testament, Romans 8:28, in the back of your mind. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. Put that in your mind a little bit. And King Cyrus acknowledged the sovereignty of God when he said, "I will send people away." And He's going to send them to their own land. And he attributes his own success and power to God. And he says, God has given me the power to control the world and conquer. Now He is saying that I should send you, the Jews, back to your land. I want you to build a place of worship for your own God. And this refers to the temple. And this temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians many years earlier. The temple was the center of Jewish worship and symbol of their identity as God's chosen people. the Jewish people only had this thing to refer to them as God's people, and it was the temple of God. And the temple was destroyed by allowing the Jews to rebuild the temple. The King Cyrus was acknowledging the importance of their faith and their relationship to God. Do you see how God is working? And God is a God of promise, and even He's working through this pagan king to accomplish His purpose. God had promised to restore the Jewish people to their land and allow them to rebuild the temple. And He uses this pagan king to fulfill His promise. He goes beyond our imagination. We have a certain way. If you've been a Christian for a long time, those of you who are Christian, those of you who are not Christian, you're lucky. Because you don't have this kind of mindset. For those of us who've been Christian for a long time, we have this set thing, and we categorize things, and we put God in the box and say, this is how God ought to work. But if you haven't been thinking in this way, I want you to really, really ask if God can really speak to you at the same time, that He can work through the most unlikely circumstances and people to bring about His plans and fulfill His promises. But here's an interesting thing about God keeping His promises. God will keep His promises through our obedient response. This is very important, folks. When His people return to their God in repentance, then they will experience the promise of God's fulfillment. You see, the reason why I'm saying this is because I want you to accept the importance of holding on to God's control and human responsibility in tension. That we have to keep this tension of God's sovereign promise being fulfilled and our responsibility of being obedient. That when we're thinking about God fulfilling His promise, He's not fulfilling His promise in a vacuum. That God is not teaching us some kind of determinism or fatalism. Oh, it will happen. Que sera, sera. It will happen anyway. I don't have to do anything. No. God fulfills His promises through your obedient response. We can't choose, yeah, God will do it. Oh, no, we have to do. No, we have to keep that tension. Sometimes we're mentally lazy. And we just want to just stick to one thing. Say, oh, yeah, God is sovereign. He'll do all things. Or we'll say, no, I have to work hard. No, we have to keep that in tension. You're like, oh, what do you mean by that? I don't understand what that looks like. Good. That's what I mean by it. Not being so sure of one thing and saying, you know what? I can't do this. I don't understand this. I know I have to respond and I know I have to obey, but I know that God is sovereign and He'll fulfill His promises, but He will do it when I obey, but my obedience is not a condition to it. But there's that weird dynamic. The practical implication of this is that God works through and in and through us. And particularly, and I want to point out, through your life of prayer. You can experience this. I have to move on. You'll notice a phrase, the God of heaven, is used 9 times in Ezra. The God of heaven. And this, when something, a phrase or word appears over and over again, I want you have to pay attention, right? You have to put a little underline there. The God of heaven. Ezra 1, 2, 5, 11, 6, 9, 7, 12, 21, and 23, twice. The God of heaven appears. The phrase God of heaven appears in Ezra than more than any other books in the Bible. The God of heaven. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, scholars say that it only occurs 4 times. What's it pointing to? Once again, it's pointing to God's sovereignty, that God is God of heaven. He is the one who made heaven. He is the one who is in heaven. He is the one who is in heaven, in his throne, and he governs the world. Cyrus was powerful. Nebuchadnezzar was powerful. Roman Empire was powerful. But God is God of heavens. And God is God of promise. And they emphasize here in Ezra chapter 1, 2, and 3, the temple here sets the tone for this post-exilic era of the Jewish people. This is a little technical. I'll get to it soon. The God of heaven is God of Israel. And for you, God of heaven is God of your personal life. God who reigns in heaven is the one who is so intimately involved in your life. And I'll close with this last point. Third point, the Lord of worship. I heard from an experienced preacher, when you say this is the last point, people pay attention. Last point. But I have 5 points under my last point. Ezra 1, if we read through this, highlights the central role that worship played in the spiritual life of the Israelites and the importance of temple. Remember, going back to Ezra, first verse, what was the mission? What was the charge that God gave to this pagan king Cyrus? What was the mission? Do you remember? God stirred the spirit of Cyrus to do what? To return and to do what? Rebuild the temple. Right? You all with me, right? To rebuild the temple. Here's another interesting thing. I had to count this over and over again because I'm not good with numbers. And I was looking at other commentaries and I couldn't see it. But I saw this and I'm like, this must be interesting because the word house of God or house of the Lord appears 7 times in our chapter. And I had to count over and over again. I'm not a computer savvy, so I couldn't do anything else. But I had to just read over and over again to count the word house. When I think about the word house, it's not, some of you are thinking like playing poker. House, that's not what it means here. Okay? House, that's not what house means here. The house of God, 7 times. Verse 2, verse 3, verse 4, 5, 6, 7. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And 7 twice. Each time when the word house is mentioned, it's about the house of worship. So God is very concerned about his house. Returning and rebuilding the wall was just for one purpose. It was to restore their relationship with their God. And how do you restore relationship with God? For them, it was rebuild the temple. For us, it's worship. Look at verse 5 with me. Verse 5. Then rose up the heads of the fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go to build. Everyone God had stirred. God stirred the hearts of the priests and Levites and the leaders of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. God's sovereignty moved spiritual leaders who were needed to renew the worship in Jerusalem. I want to share this message and I want to challenge our leaders. Of course, I'm included in this. Has God stirred your spirit and has God stirred your heart to take worship more seriously? I want to challenge all of us. When God said, return and rebuild a house. rebuild the temple. How are you rebuilding the temple of God? How are you rebuilding your life around worship? This has been my prayer. God, stir my spirit, stir my heart to worship you. And this is the tension. This is the weird thing about Christian life. As I'm talking about God's sovereignty, God is sovereign, and He's the one who stirred the spirit of Cyrus. He's the one who stirred the spirit of these leaders. He's the one who's doing it. And at the same time, I'm trying to, now, how can I make our church people be more serious about worship and coming back and worshiping together? And it's all becoming like my action. And I have to keep that tension. God's sovereign work and my responsibility. We can't control. God has to stir the spirits. For the Jews and the Christian believers, the lesson is the utter importance of the restoration of God's presence in our lives. Of course, this is not a call to build a physical building as a house of worship. There's a need for that. I think there is a need for having physical building. But the point here is not about rebuilding a physical house of worship, but rebuilding a spiritual relationship with God through worship. For 70 years, they got by with no temple worship. For 70 years, they got so numb to their spiritual dullness. For 70 years, they thought it was okay to be spiritually stagnant. For 70 years, they had no relationship to God for some. Maybe some were bitter, and maybe some were just numbed. Either way, they did not have spiritual vitality. And my question for you is, what about you? What about you? Where are you? Where am I? Maybe for the last 3 years, we become spiritually numb. The last 3 years, we thought, okay, this is how we do this. But how do we go back and rebuild our lives together and rebuild our church together? And do you know what's more shocking? They built a temple despite opposition, but it was destroyed again. You know what's more shocking? Jesus said, I'll destroy it. And what in the world? Their temple was just a foreshadow of the ultimate temple in the person of Jesus Christ, you see. Our worship, even our worship now here, is the foreshadow of our relationship with Christ. Gathering here, doing things for God here, should not be our ultimate thing. It's a foreshadow of your long, long desire to be in the presence of God. So we can say, better is one day in your house is better than thousands elsewhere. We're not talking about 1 hour here. This is a foreshadow. This is going to come and go. Doesn't matter who preach. Doesn't matter what you do here. Doesn't matter what you experience here. Compared to, it does matter, but compared to what we will experience in the presence of Jesus, seeing Him face to face. That's our desire. Is that your desire? Is that your desire to return home and say, I want to see Christ? Jesus is our true leader who takes us to God. He's the ultimate temple who presents the presence of God. He's the only one who can rebuild and restore our broken lives. Jesus is the only way we can return to God. Are you in a spiritual exile? If you don't know where you're going, If you don't know where you're going at the end of the day, if you don't know where you're going at the end of the day, you're no different from these Old Testament exiles who are just lost and numb. No place, no purpose, no peace, living with no promise. But I pray that God would stir your heart as he stirred the pagan king's heart. I pray that God would stir my children's heart. That's my prayer. I pray that God would stir your children's heart. I pray that God would stir your heart, that you'll see, God, let me return and rebuild, looking forward to the ultimate promise.